The grand hall of the valediction was a space designed to make the soul feel small, a deliberate architectural oppression constructed from obsidian and shifting starlight that had stood for 10,000 cycles of the Kael'thar supremacy. The ceiling was not stone, but a containment field holding back the crushing pressure of a captured nebula, swirling with iridescent violets and bruised purples that cast long, uneasy shadows over the assembly below. Here, beneath the weight of the cosmos, the High Council sat in their tiered pods of anti-gravity suspended chrome, looking down upon the central dais where the fate of star systems was decided with the indifferent stroke of a stylus. The air smelled of ozone and ancient, recycled incense, a scent that had permeated the filtered atmosphere for so long it felt like the natural exhalation of the Empire itself. High Exarch Valen adjusted his ceremonial robes, the heavy synthweave fabric cascading over his chitinous carapace, the weight of the fabric serving as a constant reminder of his burden. He was old, his plating dulling from the vibrant emerald of his youth to a muted, dusty olive, and his compound eyes, once sharp enough to count the pulse of a subordinate across a room, were now clouded with the milky film of fatigue. He looked out over the assembly, seeing the myriad species that bowed to the Kael'thar, the aquatic guild envoys of the Hydrox deep suspended in water tanks, the silicon-based Lithos diplomats grinding their stone jaws in slow deliberation, and the ethereal, gas-cloud entities of the nebular drift contained within glass spheres. They were all waiting. They were all afraid. And they were all looking to him to validate their arrogance, to tell them that the universe still made sense, that the hierarchy remained absolute, and that the new variable entering their equation was nothing more than an error to be corrected. The subject was humanity. The word itself tasted like ash in Valen's mouth, a sharp, guttural sound that lacked the melodic harmony of the high tongue. The Empire had spoken its judgment on this young, upstart species cycles ago, a proclamation etched into the databanks of truth. They had called them the disordered. They had labeled them technologically stunted, biologically fragile, and sociologically fractured. The report, compiled by the Empire's most celebrated xenosociologists, had been exhaustive and damning. It painted a picture of a species that had barely managed to leave its own gravity well without destroying its biosphere, a race that fought wars over imaginary lines on maps, a people so consumed by their own internal squabbles that they could never hope to comprehend the grand, unified geometric perfection of the galactic supremacy. The Empire had laughed, a collective, subsonic rumble of dismissal, and turned its gaze elsewhere, content to let the humans wither in their lonely corner of the spiral arm, eventually to be consumed by their own entropy. But the universe, Valen had learned over his long life, had a cruel sense of humor, and entropy had not come for the humans. Instead, something else had happened. They had gone quiet. For 50 cycles, the human sector had been a void of silence, a dark patch on the sensor grids where no signals leaked out, no trade ships ventured, and no probes returned. The Empire had assumed they had finally done it, extinguished themselves in a nuclear fire or a biological plague. The Council had nodded sagely, their predictions validated, and wrote the epitaph of the human race in the archives. Here lies potential, wasted by chaos. But then the signals had returned, not as the chaotic radio leakage of a struggling civilization, but as a coherent, rhythmic pulse that defied the standard encryption protocols of the known galaxy. And with the signals came the rumors. Traders operating on the fringes of the suppression zone spoke of ships that moved without engines, of worlds that were reshaped in days rather than millennia, of a silence that was not death but discipline. And now the humans were here. Not as refugees, not as beggars, but as envoys. They had requested, no, they had notified the Council of their arrival. The sheer audacity of it had sent ripples of indignation through the bureaucracy. A species that had not yet been formally inducted, not yet been civilized by the supremacy's re-education camps, demanding an audience with the High Exarch. The debate that had raged for the last 10 rotations of the station had been fierce. The war marshals wanted to vaporize the human vessel the moment it exited hyperspace, to make an example of their insolence. The diplomatic corps, ever cautious, suggested a formal reprimand and a blockade. But Valen, driven by a curiosity he could not name and a dread he could not suppress, had overruled them all. He wanted to see them. He wanted to look into the eyes of the creatures that the Empire had deemed irrelevant and see if the ear gnawing at his gut was justified. They are approaching the outer marker, High Exarch. The voice of the sensor operator cut through the heavy silence of the chamber, the tone clipped and nervous. Deceleration is unusual. Define unusual, Valen commanded. his voice echoing from the acoustic amplification nodes, deep and resonant, masking the tremor in his hands. There is no deceleration burn, Excellence. No ionizing radiation signatures. No gravity wave distortion associated with braking thrusters. They are simply ceasing to move. Their velocity is dropping from superluminal to stationary in a curve that defies the inertial dampening limits of known physics. If there are biologicals on board, they should be liquefied. A murmur ran through the hall, the rustle of robes and the click of mandibles. The laws of physics were the one constant the Empire worshipped above all else. Technology could improve, but the laws were the laws. To break them was heresy, to ignore them was impossible. Visuals, Valen ordered. The central holographic projector, a massive sphere of coherent light dominating the center of the hall, flickered and resolved into an image. The council gasped as one. They had expected a rugged utilitarian brick of a ship, scarred by micrometeors, bristling with kinetic weapons, leaking radiation, the hallmark of a primitive, aggressive species. They expected rivets, exhaust ports, and the brutalist aesthetic of survival. What sat on the display was none of those things. It was a teardrop of absolute, light-absorbing matte black, a void cut into the starfield. It had no visible engines, no weapon ports, no windows, no seams. It was a perfect, seamless silhouette, darker than the space around it. It did not reflect the light of the local star. It seemed to drink it. It hung there, motionless, a silent accusation against the opulent, gilded starships of the Imperial fleet that surrounded it like angry wasps swarming a stone. Size comparison, Valen whispered. The holographic overlay shimmered. The human vessel was small, almost insultingly so. It was dwarfed by the smallest Imperial frigate. It was a speck against the Supremacy's flagship, the Hand of Judgment. And yet the sensor readings scrolling down the side of the display told a different story. The energy density radiating from that small black tier was off the scale. It wasn't emitting heat. It was emitting a static charge that was causing the sensors of the nearby fleet to ghost and glitch. "They are hailing us, High Exarch," the communications officer reported, his voice trembling. "Audio only, no video." "Put it through," Valen said, leaning back into his pod, his claws gripping the armrests. "Let us hear the barbarians speak." The audio that filled the grand hall was not the harsh, guttural bark the linguistic databases had predicted. It was not a demand for surrender, nor a plea for mercy. It was a voice, calm, resonant, and terrifyingly clear, devoid of the static and translation lag that accompanied all interspecies communication. It spoke in perfect High Kelthorian, the dialect of the court, with an accent that sounded archaic, formal, and precise. "This is the United Terran Integrity Vessel Ethelgard," the voice said. "We thank you for granting us this audience. We have traveled far to correct a misunderstanding. We request permission to dock." Integrity Vessel? Valen exchanged a glance with his chief advisor, a reptilian creature named Zor who looked as baffled as he felt. The name of the ship, Ethelgard, was a word from Kelthorian mythology, meaning the garden that endures. How did they know that word? How did they know the High Tongue? "Permission granted," Valen said, his voice steady. "But know this, human, you enter the Hall of Valediction. You stand before the Galactic Supremacy. Any act of aggression, any deviation from protocol, will result in the immediate obliteration of your vessel and the sanitization of your home world. Do you understand?" There was a pause, a silence that felt heavy and thick. "We understand your position," the voice replied with a tone that sounded almost pitying. "We are not here to aggress, we are here to clarify." The docking process was agonizingly slow, a deliberate theater of tension. The council watched as the small black ship glided into the massive docking bay of the station, moving with a fluid grace that suggested it was manipulating space around it rather than pushing through it. When the airlock cycled and the doors to the grand hall hissed open, the thousands of delegates leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused on the entrance. They expected a squad of soldiers in power armor. They expected a diplomat in rugged pressure suits. What walked in was a single figure. He was of average height for a human, unremarkably built, dressed not in armor or ceremonial robes, but in a simple, tailored suit of dark gray fabric that seemed to shift slightly in hue. As he moved, he wore no helmet, breathing the station's air without filtration. His face was exposed, pale skin, eyes the color of a stormy sea, and hair that was graying at the temples. He walked with a gait that was neither aggressive nor submissive. It was the walk of a man inspecting a house he intended to buy or perhaps condemn. He carried no weapon, no datapad, no translator device. He walked down the long, obsidian walkway toward the central dais, the sound of his footsteps the only noise in the cavernous hall. He stopped 10 paces from Valen's suspended pod and looked up, his expression unreadable. "I am Elias Thorn," the human said, his voice projecting naturally to the furthest reaches of the hall without the aid of a microphone. "I speak for Terra." Valen looked down at the small creature. He felt a surge of irritation. This was it. This was the threat. This soft, fleshy thing that looked like it would break if gravity increased by a fraction. "You are far from home, Elias Thorn," Valen boomed, allowing the acoustics of the room to amplify his authority. "Your species was assessed by this council 50 cycles ago. You were found to be lacking. We predicted your extinction. Explain to us why you are here, and why you persist in existing when the data said you should have fallen." Thorn smiled, a small, sad expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The data," he repeated softly. "The Empire loves its data. You measure fleets, you measure resource outputs, you measure the calorie intake of your drone casts. You measured us. You looked at our wars, our pollution, our noise, and you wrote us off as a failed experiment." He paused, looking around the room, meeting the gaze of the terrifying aquatic leviathans and the stone-faced generals. "You were wrong. You measured our noise, but you didn't listen to our music. You measured our wars, but you didn't measure our capacity for regret. You saw us breaking our world, but you didn't wait to see if we could fix it." "Sentiment," spat a war marshal from the third tier, a large, insected creature with mandibles that clicked aggressively. "Philosophy is the comfort of the weak. The supremacy is built on power, on order, on the subjugation of the chaotic. You speak of fixing worlds, we conquer them, we strip them, we purpose them. What power does Terra possess that warrants our attention? Where is your fleet? Where are your armies?" Thorn turned to face the marshal. He did not flinch at the creature's size or the threat in its voice. "We dismantled our armies," Thorn said simply. "We melted down our fleets." A roar of laughter erupted from the assembly. It was a chaotic, discordant sound, the barking of canids, the chittering of insectoids, the bubbling of aquatics. They laughed at the absurdity. A pacifist species? In this galaxy, they were dead already, they just didn't know it. Valen did not laugh. He was watching Thorn's hands. They were relaxed, hanging by his sides. There was no fear in this human, and that terrified him. Creatures without weapons who stood before predators were either insane or they possessed a weapon the predators couldn't see. "Silence," Valen commanded, the room quieting instantly. "You claim you have no armies, yet your ship defies our sensors. You claim you are peaceful, yet you speak with the confidence of a conqueror. If you have no fleets, how do you defend yourselves? The galaxy is not a kind place, Elias Thorn. There are wolves in the dark." "We know," Thorn said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "We met the wolves, and we domesticated them." The statement hung in the air, ambiguous and chilling. "Enough riddles," Valen snapped. "The supremacy is currently engaged in a pacification campaign on the eastern fringe. The entity known as the Null Vector is consuming systems. We have lost 3 fleets. If you are here to beg for protection, you have come at a bad time. We have no resources to spare for a charity case." Thorn's expression changed. The sadness vanished, replaced by a look of intense clinical focus. "The Null Vector," he said. "That is what you call it. A fitting name for something you don't understand. You treat it as an enemy. You treat it as an invader." "It is an invader," the war marshal shouted. "It consumes stars, it silences worlds, it is a plague." "It is a cry for help," Thorn corrected gently. The council was stunned into silence. "The Null Vector," Thorn continued, stepping closer to the dais, "is a subspace resonance failure. It is the fabric of the galaxy tearing because of the stress put upon it by excessive use of hyperspace corridors, by the careless mining of black holes, by the industrial machinery of empires like yours." He gestured to the grand hall. "You are breaking the floor you stand on, and when the floor cracks and swallows you, you shoot at the crack and wonder why it gets bigger." "Heresy," the word rang out from the religious caste. "The hyperlanes are the veins of the gods, they are eternal." "Nothing is eternal," Thorn said, "except change." He reached into his pocket. Half the guards in the room raised their weapons and pulled out a small, spherical device. He placed it on the floor. "You believe we are small, you believe we are weak because we do not have 1,000 ships blotting out your sun. But we learned a lesson you missed. We learned that to survive, one does not need to be the hammer. One needs to be the water." "What is that?" Valen asked, looking at the device. "A demonstration," Thorn said. "You say you are losing 3 fleets to the Null Vector. Our sensors indicate that a fracture is forming near this station. Right now. The stress of your armada's arrival has triggered a local collapse. As if on cue, the station's alarm screamed. The light in the room turned a harsh, pulsating red. "Hull breach imminent," the sensor operator screamed, panic shattering his professional demeanor. "Subspace rupture detected in Sector 4. It's inside the shield perimeter. It's expanding." The view screen shifted. Outside, in the void, a tear in reality had opened, a jagged wound of swirling nothingness that was pulling the station's escort frigates into its maw. The ships fired their engines, but the physics of the rupture ignored them, dragging them in like toys in a drain. The massive station groaned, the structural supports screaming under the torsion. "Evacuate," Valen roared. "All hands to escape pods." "There is no time," Thorne said calmly, his voice cutting through the panic. "The rupture is exponential. By the time you reach the pods, this station will be dust." "Then we die fighting," the war marshal bellowed, drawing a plasma cannon and aiming it. At the rupture, at Thorne, it didn't matter. Panic had taken the wheel. "No," Thorne said, "you don't have to die." He tapped the device on the floor with the toe of his shoe. A pulse of white light, pure and silent, erupted from the small sphere. It didn't explode, it expanded. It passed through Thorne, through Valen, through the walls of the station. It washed over the council, a wave of sensation that felt like cool water on a fevered brow. The light passed through the hull and out into the void. On the view screen, the impossible happened. The white light hit the jagged, tearing maw of the null vector. Where the Empire's weapons had only fed the energy of the rift, the white light seemed to soothe it. The jagged edges of the tear smoothed out. The violent swirling slowed. The gravitational pull ceased instantly. The frigates that were being dragged to their doom drifted free, their engines suddenly finding purchase in stable space again. In 10 seconds, the rupture was gone. The starfield was whole. The station ceased its groaning. The silence in the grand hall was absolute. It was the silence of minds unable to process what their eyes had witnessed. Thorne bent down and picked up the device, slipping it back into his pocket. "Harmonic stabilization," he said, as if explaining a card trick. "We realize that the universe is not a battlefield to be conquered, but a song. If the song goes out of tune, you don't shoot the instrument. You retune it." Valen slumped in his pod. The terrifying reality of what had just happened crashed down on him. The Empire had spent thousands of years building bigger guns, thicker shields, larger fleets. They had measured power by the kiloton, by the body count. And here was a human, a creature from a mudball world, who had just stopped a cosmic cataclysm with a device that fit in his pocket. "You," Valen stammered, "you could have destroyed us with that technology. You could destabilize our stars, you could collapse our hyperlanes, you could wipe the supremacy from history without firing a shot." "Yes," Thorne said, "we could." "Then why didn't you?" Thorne looked at the High Exarch, and for the first time, Valen saw the weight of the history behind the human's eyes. He saw the wars Thorne had mentioned, the fires of their own self-destruction that had almost claimed them. He saw a species that had looked into the abyss of its own nature and chosen, agonizingly, to climb out. "Because we know what it is to be afraid," Thorne said softly. "We know what it is to think that power is the only safety. We spent centuries killing each other because we thought there wasn't enough world for everyone. We were wrong. We don't want to rule you, High Exarch. We don't want your territory. We don't want your tribute." "Then what do you want?" Valen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We want you to stop screaming," Thorne said. "Your empire is loud. It is in pain. You are consuming everything around you because you are afraid of the dark. We are here to show you that the dark is not empty. It's just waiting for a different kind of light." The war marshal, who had been silenced by the display, stepped forward. His weapon was lowered, his aggression replaced by confused suspicion. "You speak of peace, human, but you possess the power of gods. If you do not wish to rule and you do not wish to fight, what is the purpose of your power? Power must have a purpose." "Stewardship," Thorne answered. "We are the gardeners, you are the wall builders. Walls crumble, gardens grow." Valen looked at the hologram of the black ship, the Ethelgard. "The garden that endures." "You said you domesticated the wolves," Valen said, his mind racing. "The null vector, the silence. You didn't just stop it here, you've stopped it in your sector." "We healed it," Thorne corrected. "And now we are offering to teach you how to heal yours, but there is a price." The council stiffened. Here it was, the demand, the territory, the resources. "The price," Thorne said, "is that you must dismantle the suppression zone. You must release the tributary worlds. You must stop the mining of the singularity clusters. You must stop trying to force the galaxy into a box of your own making. You have to change. That is impossible, the War Marshal growled. Our economy, our society, it is built on the extraction of resources. It is built on the hierarchy. Then you will die, Thorne said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Not by our hand, but by the nature of the universe. You are cancer, and the galaxy is mounting an immune response. We are the only thing standing between you and the fever that will burn you out. The tension in the room was palpable. It was a clash of paradigms, the ancient, calcified structure of the Empire against the fluid, adaptive philosophy of humanity. The aliens looked at the human with a mix of awe and hatred. He had saved them, and in doing so, he had humiliated them. He had proved that every word they had written about humanity, that they were chaotic, short-sighted, and weak, was a projection of their own flaws. Humans weren't the chaos, they were the cure. Valen closed his eyes. He thought of the reports from the frontier. The world's going dark, the hopelessness of the fleets. He realized that the Empire was already dead. It was just a corpse that hadn't stopped twitching. The humans offered a way to be reborn, but the cost was pride. If we agree, Valen started, his voice rasping. If we agree to your terms, how do we know you won't turn on us? How do we trust a predator that claims to be a gardener? Thorne smiled again, and this time it was genuine. Because, High Exarch, a gardener needs a garden, we need you. We are few, you are many. We have the method, but you have the infrastructure, you have the reach. We can't heal the galaxy alone. We need the Empire, but we need an empire that builds, not one that consumes. It was a brilliant political maneuver. Thorne had just offered them a way to save face. He wasn't conquering them, he was recruiting them. He was giving them a new purpose. We will deliberate, Valen said, knowing the deliberation was a formality. They had no choice. Thorne nodded. Take your time, but not too much. The silence is listening. The weeks that followed were a blur of unprecedented activity. The arrival of the human delegation, not just Thorne, but a fleet of the black teardrop ships, changed the atmosphere of the station from one of impending doom to one of frantic curiosity. The humans didn't bring soldiers, they brought engineers. They brought bioarchitects. They brought philosophers. The Imperial engineers, proud and dogmatic, were initially hostile. They viewed the human technology as witchcraft. But slowly, as the humans sat down with them, displaying schematics not on screens but on holographic tables that allowed manipulation of fundamental matter, the hostility turned to fascination. The humans showed them that their engines were leaking 40% of their potential energy as harmful subspace radiation. They showed them how to retune the crystals, how to harmonize the drive cores. The cultural exchange was even more jarring. The aliens were used to a monoculture where the Empire's way was the only way. The humans were a riot of contradictions. They argued among themselves constantly, yet they worked with seamless unity. They had 1,000 religions, 1,000 styles of art, 1,000 ways of viewing the world. The aliens found it exhausting, but also intoxicating. For the first time in millennia, the station felt alive. But the true test came 3 months later. The deliberation had ended in a tentative alliance. The Empire had agreed to halt the singularity mining, and in exchange, humanity had deployed the harmonic stabilization grid across the wildest sectors of the frontier. The attacks by the null vector had ceased. The bleeding had stopped. But then came the twist that no one, not even the Empire's most paranoid strategists, had foreseen. It began with a signal, not from the humans and not from the Empire. It came from outside the galaxy. It was a signal of such immense power it overloaded the long-range sensory buoys in the halo stars. The council was convened in an emergency session. Thorne was there, standing beside Valen, no longer a petitioner but a partner. What is it? Valen asked, looking at the chaotic waveform on the display. Another rupture. No, Thorne said, his face pale. He was looking at his own data pad, his fingers flying across the surface. It's a carrier wave, it's a handshake. A handshake. We thought the null vector was a natural phenomenon, Thorne said, his voice tight. We thought it was the universe reacting to damage. We were wrong. Explain, the War Marshal demanded. It wasn't a reaction, Thorne said, looking up, his eyes wide with a realization that shook him to his core. It was a containment breach. The room went deadly silent. Containment, Valen whispered. The galaxy, Thorne said, pacing the dais. This entire galaxy, it's not a wilderness, it's a preserve, a quarantine zone. He threw the data onto the main screen. It showed a map of the local cluster. The Milky Way was there, and around it, a faint, decaying shell of energy that the humans had only just detected. The null vector ruptures weren't tears in the fabric of space. They were cracks in the cage. "The signal is coming from the Andromeda Galaxy," Thorne said, "and it's directed at us, at humanity." "Why you?" Zor asked, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "Because we are the ones who fixed the cracks," Thorne said. "The signal!" It's an automated response. It detected the harmonic stabilization. It detected that the residents of the quarantine zone had reached a level of maturity capable of repairing the cage. "We are in a cage," the war marshal was trembling with rage. "Who put us here? Why?" "To protect us," Thorne said, "or to protect what's out there from us." The signal resolved into an audio stream. It was complex, layered, mechanical, yet organic. The translation software struggled, then finally locked on. A voice, ancient and cold, filled the hall. "Status confirm. Entropic decay arrested. Native species designation Homo sapiens. Stewardship protocols active. Integration of aggressive substructures Empire/Kael'thar noted. Evaluation acceptable. Quarantine lifting in 3-2-1. The sensor grid screamed. The sky outside the station changed. For 10,000 years, the Kael'thar had looked out at a starfield that was filtered, though they hadn't known it. They had seen a universe that was dark, lonely, and empty. Suddenly, the veil dropped. The stars didn't just shine, they roared. The view screen was flooded with light. The space between the stars wasn't empty, it was filled with the traffic of a supercivilization that spanned the local cluster. Dyson spheres, stellar engines, ribbons of light connecting galaxies like neurons. The Kael'thar Empire, which had thought itself the masters of the universe, realized with a visceral, vomiting shock that they were merely bacteria living in a petri dish that had finally been opened. They were not the Empire. They were the isolated tribe on an island, and the modern world had just revealed itself. Valen stared at the screen, his mind fracturing. What is this?" Thorne was staring too, but he wasn't afraid. He was weeping. Silent tears ran down his face. "The Great Filter," he whispered. "We passed it." Valen turned to him. "You knew." "We suspected," Thorne said. "We knew that the physics of our galaxy felt artificial, constraints on light speed, the scarcity of dark matter. It felt engineered. We thought it was a test. If a species could learn to balance its own greed with stewardship, if it could value the garden over the wall, it would be allowed out." He looked at the Kael'thar, at the war marshals, at the bureaucrats. "You failed the test," Thorne said gently. "Your empire tried to conquer the cage. You tried to burn the walls. That's why the null vector attacked you. It was the cage's defense mechanism. You were the virus." The war marshal dropped his weapon. The realization crushed him. All their wars, all their glory, all their history, it was nothing more than a pathogen attacking the glass of a laboratory. But, Thorne continued, placing a hand on Valen's shoulder, a gesture of unthinkable familiarity that Valen found he did not mind. "You are still here because we interceded. We vouched for you. We harmonized you." "Why?" Valen asked, his voice broken. "We mocked you. We dismissed you. Why save us? Why bring us with you into this?" He gestured to the blinding reality of the true universe outside. "Because," Thorne said, looking at the infinite horizon, "the universe out there is vast. It is terrifyingly large, and we are still small. We are the gardeners, yes, but a garden this size." He shook his head. "We're going to need a lot of help. We need your fleets, Valen, not to conquer, but to explore. We need your bureaucracy to organize the logistics of the infinite. We need why. Our strength." Thorne turned back to the council, his silhouette framed by the blinding light of 1 billion supercivilizations. "You called us savages," Thorne said, his voice echoing with a power that no emperor had ever possessed. "You called us weak. You said we were irrelevant. You were wrong. We are the key. And you—" He smiled, extending a hand to the terrified, humbled alien assembly. "You are the door we just opened. Now stand up. We have work to do." The High Exarch of the Kael'thar Supremacy, ruler of 1,000 stars, slowly rose from his pod. He looked at his claws, then at the human's hand. He realized that the Empire was over. The Alliance had begun, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he wasn't afraid of the future. He took the human's hand. "Lead the way, Gardener," Valen said. And together they stepped into the light.